Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the new strong and weak champions heading into patch 8.14. I am running another RP giveaway right now as well guys with a few of my YouTube friends, so if you're interested in entering into that, then there's going to be a link down in the description below. So to start it off here, we have a pretty nice buff to Ahri. Her E cost is getting lowered, and then her E charm duration is also getting increased. Now it's going from 1 second up to 1.4 at rank 1 there, and this is really big here for Ahri because in previous patches, what a lot of Ahri players would do is they would put 3 points into charm to get the charm duration up to 1.5 seconds, and a lot of people just thought that was enough for the duration, and the only reason you'd really max charm out was for the duration there. So because it's getting increased here to 1.4, you might not even want to put any more points into your E in the early game. You might just want to max your Q first now, and then just go into maxing W second and not even put a few more points into your E. So I think this is going to actually be pretty nice for Ahri. It does allow her to have more gank assist in the early game. 1.4 seconds there, or an extra 0.4 seconds, is actually pretty big when you are looking for a gank in the early game. And then because you are now going to be able to put more points into your W quicker, it does mean that your point and click damage there with your W is going to be dealing more in the mid game. So Cassio is getting buffed for next patch. I only have this buff here at a 1 though because her Q AP ratio is getting increased by 10%. Her Q's damage is getting increased by 20 once you max it out. You don't max your Q out though first on Cassio, so you're not even going to be getting too much benefit from this until later on into the game for both of these changes. And because Cassio, she's not actually building a whole lot of AP in the early game as well, and because the early game is just a lot more important right now, and these buffs don't really address buffing her early game at all, I just don't really think these changes are going to matter too much for the meta heading into next patch. So some really interesting changes to Corki here. Corki's E damage is being increased by 40 at rank 1, and the E resist shred is also being increased by a little bit there. It's going to be the same at rank 5 for both the damage and the resist shred, but the damage increase there at the rank 1 on your E is going to be really nice for the early game. I think this is more so going to help out bot lane Corki than mid lane Corki, because mid lane Corki, you're not really going to be able to get the full damage duration off on your E a lot of the time. You're not really just going to be sitting there autoing the opponent for like 3 or 4 seconds and getting the full benefit from your E. But for bot lane Corki, if you're playing with a strong all-in support and you're looking to go for a level 2 all-in, then this extra 40 damage, you're going to be able to get that off a lot of the time if you are looking for an all-in, and it's definitely going to add for some more kill pressure in the early game there with Corki. So Pantheon is actually getting buffed for next patch, a really interesting change here because right now Pantheon, I feel like he's actually in a pretty balanced state, and he isn't a champion that you'd really think would need buffs for next patch, but he's getting an attack speed increase there, and he's also getting a little bit of extra damage on his W. So they're not huge buffs, but these do help out jungle Pantheon more than top lane Pantheon because of the attack speed increase there, and then an extra 10 damage in the early game. It is going to help him out a little bit in duels, and it will help him out when clearing a little bit as well. So I don't think this makes Pantheon much stronger than what he is in this patch, but he's still going to be a pretty good pick right now in the jungle and also in the top lane for 8.14. So next up, we have some buffs to Reksai. Reksai's Q bonus AD ratio on both her burrowed and unburrowed form is getting increased, and then her ultimate's bonus AD ratio is also getting increased. So they're getting increased by a decent amount, but note here that the bonus AD ratio is getting increased. It's not a flat AD ratio on the Q and on the ultimate, so it doesn't really matter too much until you start getting some AD items, until you get your warrior, until you get like your black cleaver. So I don't think this really helps Reksai out too much for next patch. If they ended up buffing her base damage on her Q or something like that, giving her a little bit more strength in the early game, then I could see her rise up, but she's still going to be a B tier pick for 8.14. So next up here, we have two different AD carries getting buffed for next patch. The first one is Sivir. So Sivir's Q cooldown is being lowered from 9 seconds at all ranks down to 7 at all ranks. So this is an okay change to Sivir. It's not really going to make her that much stronger of a pick for next patch, at least compared to the top tier champions that are being played right now down in the bot lane. It does mean that once you get Essence Reaver and once you start mid-game team fighting, your Q is going to be on a pretty short cooldown there because of the 20% CDR you're getting from Essence Reaver, so it does add a little bit more damage to your mid-game team fighting. Also, it does add for a little bit more poke in the laning phase, but overall, this change isn't going to make Sivir that much better for next patch. So Vayne is also getting buffed here, and similar to Sivir, even though it's a decent buff here to Vayne, it doesn't really change her state for 8.14. She's still going to get dumpstered in lane by most of the meta picks right now, and these changes won't really even matter if you've already lost lane by the time you end up like getting a few points into your W. So if the meta shifts or something, and if it's not so early game focused and so snowball reliant, then these changes would be nice for Vayne if we just weren't in this meta, but I just think that even though they're nice buffs here, it's not really going to mean too much for her. So next up here, we do have a buff to Velkoz. Velkoz's Q AP ratio is getting increased from 60% up to 80%. Now this is actually a little bit bigger than you'd think because Velkoz's Q is actually on a very short cooldown. It's on about a 4-second cooldown there once you reach the mid game. So you're gonna be able to spam this out a lot in mid game team fights. And if you're able to hit like 3 or 4 Qs in a mid game team fight, that's actually a lot of extra damage there on Velkoz's Q. So I do think that this does make Velkoz a much stronger pick for 8.14, and in certain matchups and situationally, I do think he is going to be a very good pick for next patch. So next up here are some buffs to Vi. Vi's ultimate cooldown is being lowered by 20 seconds at rank 1. So this is actually a pretty decent buff here to Vi. It does mean that if you end up camping a lane once you hit level 6, you get a good ultimate off down bot lane, for example, and you pick up a kill. If you go back into your jungle, you farm for a little bit, you grab a base, and then you head back down bot lane, your ultimate's probably going to be back up by then. So this does mean that in the early game, or once you do hit level 6, you are going to be able to continuously gank a lane over and over again, and your ultimate's pretty much going to be up now every single time you're looking to do that. I still think Vi is going to be a weaker pick compared to most junglers though for next patch. She does not have great skirmishing in the early game. She's 100% reliant on landing her Q, and if her Q gets dodged or gets dashed away from or flashed in the early game, then she's not going to be able to win any duels. So I just think that overall, at least for the higher elos, Vi's still going to be a pretty weak pick for next patch, but for the lower elos, this buff actually might be pretty nice for her. So if we take a look at the weaker champions now for 8.14, the first one here is Aatrox, and Aatrox is probably getting hit with the biggest changes for next patch. He's getting a lot of changes, however, most of them are like pretty small changes, but they do add up. Even though his Q damage here is only getting lowered by 10 in the early game there, his Q minion damage is also getting lowered, his E recharge time is also getting increased there, his ultimate's cooldown is getting increased, so overall with all these changes added up here, I do think it makes Aatrox quite a bit weaker for next patch. His ultimate's AD that you get from it is being increased in the later ranks, but this doesn't really matter too much because Aatrox is the strongest in the early to mid game. If you're gonna win with this champion, it's usually because you do well in the early game and you just stomp your opponent and get a good snowball going. So that bonus damage there on his ultimate doesn't really mean that much, and I think that overall these changes should bring Aatrox a little bit more in line for next patch. So next up here is what should be a nerf to AP Fizz for next patch. So what they're doing here in next patch is they're changing the way his W works. So they're changing it to where his Q is no longer going to apply W to multiple targets. So this does mean it hurts Fizz's wave clear a little bit in the early game. This change doesn't really matter that much though. His W is also no longer going to deal triple damage when hitting a marked target, and this is the biggest change here because it does mean that Fizz's burst damage is going to be a little bit weaker. Now to compensate for that change though, they are adding in a new effect to his W to where it's now going to deal on hit damage for 5 seconds. It's also going to have a shorter cooldown, and then the W bleed damage is also getting increased there by a little bit. So overall, if I'm understanding these changes here correctly, Burst Fizz will be a bit weaker for next patch. You're not going to be getting a whole lot of damage there straight up from your W anymore, but your W is going to give you a bit more consistent damage. So for AP Burst Fizz, this does hurt him because a lot of the time, you're not just going to be standing there auto-attacking the enemy for 5 seconds to benefit from that buff too much. If you're playing like Fizz in the top lane, like Bruiser Fizz or something like that, then this probably would be a buff for next patch. It's going to be interesting to see if Bruiser Fizz does come back because of these on-hit buffs here to his W, but I think that overall your AP Fizz in the mid lane does get quite a bit weaker for next patch. So next up here, we have some nerfs to Rakan. Rakan's HP per level is getting lowered, his Q's cooldown is being increased, and then his ultimate's cooldown is also being increased. So these 3 nerfs combined here are going to bring Rakan down in power a little bit. However, he's still going to be a great pick. If you can play Rakan well, then he's still going to be a very good support for next patch. They didn't nerf his ability to engage. They didn't nerf his damage at all on any of his abilities. So once you do reach the mid to late game or even in the early game, all you need is that one all-in combo on Rakan and it can completely change the game. So he's still going to be a good pick despite these nerfs. So Talon is getting a nerf for next patch, definitely a much needed nerf to Talon because he's pretty much permabanned right now. His W's return damage is being lowered by a little bit here in the early game, and then once you do get it maxed out, it's actually being nerfed by a decent amount there, so this does bring Talon down in power a little bit. However, if you're going for Tiamat Rush on Talon, this does not really hurt his wave clear that much. It hurts his wave clear until he picks up Tiamat, so it does make his early game a little bit weaker there, but I still think that Talon's gonna be a strong pick. They didn't nerf his passive damage at all, so he's still gonna have a very good early game. Most of his damage in the early game there does come from that passive and not really from the W, so Talon, despite these changes, is still gonna be a great pick for 8.14. So next up here, we have another nerf to Zoe. Zoe's been nerfed, I think, a few patches in a row now, 2 or 3 patches. So she's getting a nerf to her W in this patch. She got a nerf to her W in last patch as well, if I'm not mistaken. Her W's AP ratio is being lowered and her W's base damage is also being lowered. Now, even though Zoe's been nerfed a lot recently, she's still stayed an S tier pick for multiple patches. I think with this change here, this might taper down out of S tier and into A tier, but Zoe's still gonna be Zoe. She's still overall a very strong pick. Her kit is just really good, so unless they do end up just completely gutting her damage and they gut her one-shot combo, she's still probably gonna stay a pretty solid pick for solo queue. So next up, we have a nerf to Wukong. Wukong is getting a 40 damage decrease on his E once you get it maxed out, and because most Wukong players do max their E out first, this will actually hurt him quite a bit. Not only does this hurt Wukong's ability to trade in the laning phase and to all in, it also hurts his ability to wave clear. I know that most high elo Wukong players, they do go Tiamat first, so if you're rushing Tiamat, then this change doesn't really matter that much, but if you're someone who wasn't going Tiamat in the past, then you're probably going to have to do that now in this patch if you're playing top lane Wukong, because his wave clear is going to be weaker and his damage, his burst combo is also going to be slightly weaker for next patch. And then lastly here, to round out the video, we've got a pretty big change to teleport. The cooldown is being increased by 60 seconds there, and the cooldown when cancelled is also being increased by 40 seconds. So I think that this is probably going to be the patch to where in solo queue, we're going to see less TP in the top lane and a lot more Ignite. Players are already running Ignite quite a bit in the top lane right now in this patch, even in the higher elos. Like if you're playing a strong early game aggressive top laner, Ignite is going to be better a lot of the time, and with this nerf here to TP, I do think we're going to be seeing it a lot less, especially like for the bot lane as well. I think that bot lane carries are probably going to want to go heal now in next patch, and then for mid lane champions, mid laners are also probably going to stop taking the teleport and they're going to switch over to the heal or Ignite or whatever they want to take other than TP. So this is a pretty big change here, and it should mean quite a bit for solo queue. For competitive scene, I still think that for top lane champions and for champions in the mid lane and the bot lane as well, you're probably still going to want to running teleport, because teleport is still really good if you do have good coordination. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. That's what we're looking at heading into patch 8.14. So there's nothing really too big in this patch that should really shift the meta too much. I think the teleport change is probably one of the bigger ones that we're definitely going to see a shift, like in the top lane meta a little bit there. More players are probably going to start going that ignite. But as for the champion changes, there's nothing that really stood out in this patch to where a champion's just going to be super OP in next patch or a champion's going to be super weak. So the meta should stay relatively the same for next patch. But with that being said, guys, if you did enjoy this video, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you've yet to already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.